Non-Americans have read it. What dark part of your history gets barely mentioned in school? Mexican here. We tend to put our indigenous cultures like Aztecs and Mayans in a pedestal and pretend they were an example of peace and wisdom and harmony with nature and each other. And we forget that the Mayans strip mined their lands for resources until they were no longer livable. And the Aztecs were so bent on getting prisoners to sacrifice that all the other Indians actually sided on the Spaniards because they seemed like a better alternative. We in Austria don't like to admit that Hitler was actually Austrian. We just accept that everyone thinks he's German and make fun of it every now and then. A lot of Austrians still act as if Austria was an innocent victim of Germany. My family was forced out of the Ukraine by the Cossacks. From what I hear, they rode into their homes on horseback, raped the women if they felt like it, and if they found a firearm they'd kill the men. My great-grandfather was a kid. His father gave him his pistol and told him to run and hide it in a haystack. They were told to leave and did. They encountered a toddler on the streets screaming for her parents, grabbed her, and continued to run. She's now my great-aunt. They traveled to Moscow and caught a train to Latvia not knowing if their train would be rerouted to the Russian gulags. They made it to Latvia and boarded a ship to Canada. The rest is history, so to speak. Canada Japanese internment camps during the Second World War, and the residential schools that lasted until the late 90s. I think the biggest smokescreen is the name, residential schools. I heard about them vaguely in class, but nobody sat me down to tell me what was really going on. They made it sound like it was just a special school for native kids that was kinda shady. I didn't know they were essentially abducting, brainwashing, beating, sexually abusing, culturally cleansing, and sometimes even killing these little kids. They should really call that phenomena something other than residential school. It makes it sound way too tame. Finland and the treatment of the Sami people. Residential school, trying to rid the children of their language and cultural identity, and taking their land as our own. That is only a few decades away. Also forced sterilizations of, for example, people with quite mild developmental disorders until the 70s. Or just being a poor, single woman. UK, the entire British Empire. It's everything up to the Tudors, Henry VIII and his 6 wives and all that, and then WW1. The East India Company and the Troubles in Ireland are somehow missed out. Was about to say the exact same thing. It's sad that for a country so rich in history, all you're taught up until GCSE level is Egyptians, Romans, Tudors, English, Civil War, WW1, WW2. I always thought the Battle of Hastings was always taught until I moved away from Hastings. Must just be a regional thing. In Spain, we are supposed to have had a wonderful peaceful transition from fascism to democracy in the 70s. But that also implies that the dictatorship's crimes have never been judged and most of the symbols remained for decades. We still have villages and streets called after Franco, the dictator. It's like finding a street in Berlin called Hitler Avenue or Reich Street. The official history has been written accordingly. We are told about the Civil War at school. Short story is, chaotic republic in the 30s, Civil War, 40 years of Catholic fascist dictatorship. But the main premise is, everybody did bad things, everybody killed. It's definitely true, but not everybody killed and tortured political enemies for years, enslaved prisoners to build monuments where hundreds of people died, supported the Nazis. At school we are told about the economical progress from the 50s to the 70s, which I think can be easily explained by European economy and recovery from war. We aren't told about the creators of our democracy either. Just as an example, one of the founders of the political party right now in the government was one of Franco's ministers. I think there might be big differences on what schools teach depending on the region they're in. This is just my experience. Many people is unhappy about how we understand our history in Spain. Australia, cultural genocide of Indigenous Australians. I went to private school in Australia and we learned everything, from the first encounters to clearing Tasmania. I guess you don't learn this in public school. No, I went to a private school. They didn't teach us a thing about the stolen generation. It was all patriotic, imperialistic, British stuff. Although I did finish high school in 2002, so that might be a factor. I learned it in primary in 2008-ish in a rural Bogan town. It's funny to have a teacher tell you about all the atrocities before ranting about muzzies and boat people ruining our way of life. Belgian here, We have never seen anything about the horrors that have happened in Congo. We learned it was colony and our old King Leopold II got a lot of wealth from there. But the 14 million people genocide rarely gets spoken about. People responsible for most human deaths in history: 1. Mao Zedong; 2. Joseph Stalin; 3. Adolf Hitler; 4. Leopold II of Belgium. Ireland here, Magdalene laundries, otherwise known as Magdalene asylums, they were used to hide fallen women. In other words, the sexually promiscuous or prostitutes. In truth, though, young unmarried mothers were forced into them by the church or families who were ashamed. They were essentially penitentiary workhouses. The women were abused both mentally and physically. When most people see the movie, The Magdalene Sisters, they think the abuse must have been exaggerated to make the film more dramatic. The stories these women tell about their time in the laundries are far more graphic and disturbing. To your main point, though, this all came out when I was in secondary school in the 1990s. So it might not have been covered in class, but every day in the papers there were new horrific revelations. So I learned it in school all the same, just from the papers instead of the teachers. I'm a Vietnamese American, and I'd say it was the atrocities committed by Ho Chi Minh. Of course, in Vietnam, being a communist country, the propaganda machine won't acknowledge Ho Chi Minh as anything but a hero, but even in my American history courses living in Illinois, some of my more left-leaning teachers or textbooks don't even mention the policies he had that literally put thousands of innocent villagers to death. All they want to talk about is how Ho Chi Minh successfully created a country that took on the US and forced it out. A man who was more patriot than communist, as the propaganda puts it. But he did very, very similar things to Stalin, Mao, and other communist leaders regarding reform and political restructuring of Vietnam. No one really talks about how many people he ordered to be killed, and my grandpa actually had to flee North Vietnam because his family was being persecuted themselves. If anything, Ho Chi Minh had the intent to be as bad as Mao, just not the means. Not only that, Ho Chi Minh absorbed a number of factions that had fought the French and through that became known as the leader of the Viet Minh, and liberated Vietnam. But he was just a player among many. I think there's really no better indicator of this than the Saigon War Memorial. It's nothing but wall-to-wall propaganda demonizing American troops and leonizing the Viet Cong. Like, it's true, some of the things done by the American military during the war were horrific, and the use of Agent Orange should be seen as a goddamn war crime. But the North Vietnamese did some horrible things themselves, as you've pointed out. If you were to believe the War Memorial, however, the Viet Cong were an incorruptibly pure army of martyrs sweeping in to save innocent civilians from the American demons. Martial law in the Philippines. Through the 70s and 80s we had a US-backed dictator ravage the country. Sadly, his and his family's actions never made it to our textbooks. Everything the newer generation knows about martial law is stories from their parents and grandparents. The effect? We nearly voted the dictator's son into office for VP in the recent elections. Education is important, folks, never forget. Australia, the Irish Wars. Australia had a lengthy period of Republican insurgency which has had an immense impact on our culture, particularly the Catholic-Anglican divide, which has died down in the past few decades. Understandably, it's been forgotten like some other unpalatable parts of our history. Brazil's transition to a republic, and how even though we think republics are all great, this king was actually a genuine good guy. King Pedro II of Brazil's whole life story and the aftermath is sometimes depressing and sometimes inspiring. Crazy how I see Pedro II mentioned everywhere after I first learned about him from Civ 6. There seem to be a lot of Brazilians who consider him their last great leader. I felt genuinely sad when I first heard his defeat quote in the game, even more so when I learned they were his actual last words. Made sure to put some extra effort into his cities. The Bengal famine. Nobody taught me about this in school. The worst atrocity commits by the colonial government. The crazy thing about the Bengal famine is it is only one side of a great colonial atrocity by the British. Then famine happened because the East India Company refused to allow farmers to grow food crops. All the farmers had to grow opium. That's what led to the food shortage. And that opium? It was taken to China to create a vast mass of addicts, leading to the Chinese Opium Wars. This still reverberates across the world today, in the form of Asian officialdom's attitudes towards all drugs and in the existence of historical and current narco-financier HSBC. Also the systematic destruction of the textile industry in Bengal, which had been a major employer in the region, to prevent the high-quality handmade products competing with the untaxed factory-made British goods that were being dumped on the country. There's a charming story about British soldiers cutting off the thumbs of thousands of weavers to prevent them from operating their handlooms when they defied the new laws. I've often heard it said in India that the British turned honest weavers and farmers into beggars and drug producers. What dark part of your history gets barely mentioned in school? Leave a comment and subscribe to the channel if you want to see more videos like this one.